Night settled uneasily over the Persian Gulf. The air carried the thick smell of fuel and salt water, drifting across quiet ports and sleeping cities. Radar stations hummed faintly in the darkness. Cargo ships rocked gently against their moorings. In distant desert outposts, soldiers stood watch beneath cold stars, listening to radios crackle with fragments of uncertain reports. For months, tension had been tightening across the Middle East like a wire pulled too far. But on this night, that wire finally snapped. Shortly after midnight, the first alarms sounded. Missile defense systems began to awaken across the region. Radar operators watched their screens bloom with sudden movement. Civilian phones lit up with emergency alerts. Military command centers flooded with hurried voices as satellite feeds streamed images of rockets rising from hidden launch platforms. Within minutes, the quiet night had transformed into the opening hours of a conflict that would not remain confined to borders, alliances, or old rivalries. The first 72 hours of the Iran War had begun. And before those hours were finished, the entire Middle East would realize that the conflict unfolding before them would not stay local. The tension that ignited those first missiles had not appeared overnight. For decades, the Middle East had lived under a fragile equilibrium shaped by rival ideologies, religious divisions, economic competition, and global power struggles. Iran stood at the center of that fragile balance. A nation with deep history, powerful identity, and ambitions that extended far beyond its borders. Since the late 20th century, Iran had cultivated a complex network of influence throughout the region. Allied militias, political movements, and sympathetic governments formed a web that stretched from the mountains of Lebanon to the plains of Iraq, from Syria's battered cities to Yemen's deserts. For Iran's leadership, this network represented strategic depth, a defensive shield against enemies who surrounded them. For their rivals, it represented something far more dangerous. Saudi Arabia viewed Iranian expansion as an existential threat to its position in the Islamic world. Israel saw Iranian proxies on its borders as a permanent military danger. Gulf states feared that Tehran's influence might one day destabilize their own fragile political systems. Meanwhile, global powers watched the region carefully. Oil routes crossed its waters. Shipping lanes threaded through narrow straits. Military bases dotted the desert landscapes. Any major war here could ripple outward, affecting economies and security systems across the world. Yet for years, direct confrontation had been avoided. Proxy conflicts erupted in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. Drone strikes and cyber operations escalated tensions. Sanctions squeezed Iran's economy. Military exercises demonstrated strength. But the region's leaders still believed that the boundaries of conflict would remain controlled, contained, limited. The first 72 hours of war shattered that belief. When the first missiles launched, many military analysts initially assumed the strikes would follow the familiar patterns of regional confrontation. A brief exchange, a symbolic retaliation, a return to uneasy silence. History offered precedent for such expectations. In previous confrontations, both sides had carefully calibrated their responses to avoid triggering full regional escalation. But this time, the scale was different. Within the first hour, satellite tracking systems recorded dozens of missile launches. Then hundreds. Ballistic trajectories arced across radar screens like a sudden storm of steel. Some missiles targeted military bases housing foreign forces. Others aimed toward regional air defense installations and strategic infrastructure. Air defense systems across the region activated almost simultaneously. Patriot batteries turned toward the sky. Interceptor missiles roared upward, leaving bright streaks of fire across the darkness. Explosions flashed silently above cities. Momentary bursts of light against the night sky as incoming warheads collided with defensive interceptors. For civilians on the ground, the sky seemed to ignite. The sounds that followed would become the first shared memory of the war. The distant thunder of missile interceptions, echoing across rooftops and desert landscapes. That sound would repeat throughout the first 72 hours, a rhythm of conflict marking each stage of escalation. Military command centers quickly realized that this was not a limited exchange. This was the beginning of a campaign. Across the Persian Gulf, naval vessels began repositioning almost immediately. Aircraft carriers altered their patrol routes. Destroyers activated missile defense systems designed to shield fleets and coastal installations. Airbases that had been operating in routine peacetime conditions suddenly transitioned to full wartime readiness. Pilots ran toward waiting aircraft. Maintenance crews loaded weapons beneath the wings of fighter jets. Commanders studied incoming intelligence reports that arrived faster than they could be analyzed. Within the first 6 hours of the conflict, the strategic picture was already becoming clear. The war would not remain within a single battlefield. It would spread across the entire region. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz had been recognized as one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. Nearly a fifth of global oil shipments passed through its narrow waters each day. Iran had often threatened that in the event of war, the strait could be closed. Many observers had dismissed such warnings as political rhetoric. But during the first day of the conflict, commercial shipping companies began issuing emergency alerts to vessels approaching the Gulf. Insurance rates for maritime transit surged overnight. Naval patrols intensified. Tankers slowed their movements as captains awaited instructions from international shipping authorities. The world's energy markets reacted instantly. Prices surged as traders anticipated the possibility of disrupted oil flows. In financial centers thousands of miles away, screens flickered with rapidly rising numbers. The economic shockwaves had begun even before the first full day of fighting ended. But inside the region itself, the psychological shock was even greater. For many citizens of Middle Eastern nations, war had long existed as a distant possibility. Something discussed by analysts and politicians but rarely experienced directly. That illusion began to dissolve during the first night. Air raid sirens sounded in cities that had not heard them for decades. Families gathered in stairwells and basements. Parents turned on television broadcasts that offered little clarity, only fragments of official statements and rapidly changing news updates. The skies above them carried the silent traces of missiles and interceptors. And the distant thunder of explosions reminded everyone listening that the conflict was no longer theoretical. It was happening now. Military intelligence agencies across the region worked through the night, trying to understand the scale and objectives of the Iranian strikes. Some missiles had targeted bases used by American forces stationed in Iraq and Syria. Others had aimed at Israeli military infrastructure. Several landed near Gulf state oil installations, damaging storage facilities and pipelines. But the pattern suggested something larger than simple retaliation. Iran's strategy appeared designed to send a message. The war would not be confined to one border. Every ally and every rival would feel its reach. In the early hours of the second day, coalition governments across the region convened emergency security meetings. Leaders who had spent years managing careful diplomatic balances now faced immediate decisions. Should they join the conflict directly? Should they remain defensive? Or should they attempt to mediate before escalation spiraled beyond control? Each choice carried enormous risks. For Israel, the question was particularly urgent. Iranian-backed militias in Lebanon and Syria possessed thousands of rockets capable of reaching Israeli territory. Military planners had long warned that any large-scale war with Iran could trigger simultaneous attacks from multiple fronts. Within hours of the initial missile launches, Israeli air defense networks were placed on their highest alert level. Fighter aircraft patrolled the skies along the northern border. Intelligence units monitored communications from militia groups scattered across neighboring territories. They were listening for the signal that might transform the conflict from regional tension into full multi-front war. That signal never arrived during the first 72 hours. But the possibility hung over every decision. For American military forces stationed across the region, the opening hours of the war carried a different form of tension. Bases in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf had long operated under the assumption that they might become targets in the event of confrontation with Iran. Protective bunkers had been built, missile defense systems installed, emergency procedures rehearsed repeatedly. Yet the sudden reality of incoming missiles still produced a profound psychological shift. Soldiers who had previously experienced the region as a deployment zone dangerous but manageable, now understood that they had entered a direct battlefield. Radar alarms, warning sirens, and interception explosions became part of daily routine. The sound of distant detonations replaced the ordinary rhythms of base life. And with every intercepted missile, commanders knew that the next wave might be larger. Military historians would later compare those first hours to the opening moments of other major conflicts, the shock that spreads when years of tension suddenly transform into open war. Yet the unique complexity of the Middle East meant that no previous war offered a perfect comparison. This was not a single battlefield. It was a network of overlapping rivalries, alliances, and ideological struggles. Every action carried the potential to ignite another front. By the end of the first 24 hours, the scale of international attention had grown dramatically. Diplomatic channels that had remained quiet for months suddenly flooded with urgent communications. Foreign ministers called emergency meetings. United Nations representatives drafted statements calling for restraint. Major powers issued warnings urging both sides to avoid actions that might widen the conflict. But events on the ground moved faster than diplomacy could follow. During the second day of fighting, new reports began to emerge from across the region. Small militia groups aligned with Iran began launching limited attacks against military installations belonging to rival states. Drone strikes targeted supply depots. Rocket fire struck remote bases. These attacks were not yet large enough to trigger full escalation, but they revealed the broader structure of Iran's regional strategy. The conflict was being fought through layers: direct missile strikes, proxy militia operations, cyber attacks targeting infrastructure. Each layer expanded the battlefield. Each layer made the conflict harder to contain. For neighboring governments, the realization came gradually but unmistakably. This war was not confined to two nations. It was unfolding across the entire strategic map of the Middle East. And it was only beginning. By the 48th hour, the skies over parts of the region had become a constant theater of movement. Reconnaissance drones circled silently above border zones. Fighter jets conducted patrols designed to deter further missile launches. Naval fleets maneuvered cautiously through contested waters. In command centers, massive digital maps displayed streams of data representing missile trajectories, radar contacts, satellite imagery, and intelligence reports. Military planners struggled to interpret patterns that were changing hour by hour. Some analysts believed Iran had already demonstrated the full extent of its opening strategy. Others warned that the largest operations might still lie ahead. History offered examples of both possibilities. In many wars, the first strike is designed to shock and destabilize before negotiations begin. In others, the opening blow is only a prelude to deeper escalation. By the third day, governments across the region had reached a sobering conclusion. The conflict could not be ignored, could not be isolated, and it would not end quickly. Oil markets continued to fluctuate wildly as traders attempted to assess whether the Strait of Hormuz would remain open. Shipping companies diverted vessels away from the most dangerous routes. Airlines altered flight paths to avoid contested airspace. Ordinary economic activity across the region slowed as uncertainty spread through businesses and communities. But beyond the strategic calculations and economic concerns, something deeper was unfolding in the minds of millions of people. For decades, many citizens of the Middle East had grown accustomed to living in the shadow of potential conflict. Yet they had also learned to believe that certain boundaries would never be crossed. Large-scale regional war belonged to the past, to the memories of older generations who had lived through earlier crises. The first 72 hours of the Iran war forced an entire region to confront a new reality. Those boundaries had vanished. The thunder of missile interceptions in the night sky had become a symbol of that transformation. A sound that began as distant echoes during the first hours of fighting now carried a deeper meaning. It represented the moment when the Middle East realized that the conflict unfolding before them would not remain contained. History often measures wars by their length, their battles, or their final outcomes. But sometimes the most significant transformation occurs at the very beginning. In the opening hours when expectations collapse. In the moment when familiar assumptions dissolve. During the first 72 hours of the Iran war, the Middle East crossed such a threshold. The region had entered a new chapter of uncertainty, and like the echoes of distant thunder rolling across desert skies, the consequences of those first hours would continue to reverberate far beyond the battlefield. For wars rarely remain confined to the places where they begin. They expand through alliances, fears, ambitions, and misunderstandings. They reshape economies, societies, and political landscapes. And long after the missiles fall silent, the memory of those first moments remains. The night when alarms sounded, the sky lit with sudden fire, and a region realized that the conflict before them would not stay local.